My guest today is David Wright.
I am English. I'm 82 years old, and I live in Australia with my wife of 60 years. We have 3 sons. When I left school, I joined the Royal Navy, and I went to the Navy Officers Training College at Dartmouth. And after that, I went on to the Royal Navy Engineering College, and I graduated with a degree in engineering, which included, of course, the subjects of chemistry, physics, and thermodynamics. So I know a little bit about scientific matters. Then I served as the engineer officer of 2 diesel-electric submarines, one after the other, and I retired from the Navy as a lieutenant commander.
I became aware of you because I saw your work in The Conservative Woman. You wrote some great stuff on net zero. How did you get to the point where you started writing about climate change?
Well, I first started getting interested in climate change almost certainly with watching Al Gore's film in 2006, An Inconvenient Truth, which I thought was quite convincing. And then shortly after that, I read quite widely in current affairs and that sort of thing. But then shortly after that, I saw an article which basically showed that the hockey stick graph, which Gore relied on so strongly, was actually fraudulently produced. And I thought, hang on a minute, this makes this whole thing look a bit dodgy. And I began reading more and more of the non-mainstream media, which showed me that a lot of, well, if not all of, the stuff that was being produced by the global warming community was based on false information. And the more I read, reading podcasts and articles and books, I've read at least 14 books on the subject of global warming or climate change on both sides of the argument. And I read everything I can lay my hands on in the media, mostly non-mainstream media, because there is very little on the mainstream media, because most of them are actually fully paid up members of the AGW hoax. So yes, that's how I got into it, and that's how I keep interested in it. I read blogs like Anthony Watts, What's Up With That? Of course, I also read a very good English blogger called Paul Homewood. His blog is called Not a Lot of People Know That. And then there are big organizations like CFACT, and also the other one, that's CFACT, and there is another one that name escapes me for a moment. I'll think of it in a moment.
Heartland? Is it Heartland or a GWP?
The Heartland Institute. Yes, it is. Yes. So I read them. So, and there's also the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which was founded by the late Lord Nigel Lawson, who is a very successful finance minister under Margaret Thatcher. And his organization produces a lot of very good factual material, which gives you the reality of the world's climate. So that is basically where my interests are and where I keep doing my research.
So speaking of The Conservative Woman, just as I was researching you, I looked around there and I found a lot of good stuff. There's a 4-part series called The Climate Change Cult and the War on the Mind by Stephen McMurray. And then I also saw Climate Cult's Crazed Attack on White Men by Niall McRae, and The Religious Cult of Climate Catastrophism by Andrew Montford. And finally, The Real Climate Crisis is Sinister Ideology by Ben Pyle. So I'm very happy to see that there's a site out there where people are not mincing words and talking about the truth of what's going on here. How did you get connected with that website to start writing for them?
Well, funnily enough, I have one of my sons lives in England, in London, and he was the first person who suggested I have a look at The Conservative Woman. I haven't been reading the website since its beginning, but as soon as he put me onto it, I started reading articles, and I saw that, there were articles that were so full of sense and common sense, and talking about things which the mainstream media and public speakers didn't want to talk about. And so I have read it religiously every day ever since.
Okay. And what books have you read from the other side, from the warmist side? Or books or movies? What other stuff have you consumed, warmist stuff?
Okay, well, 3 books in particular, one of which was a book called This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. You may have heard of her, an ultra-left-wing, ultra-warmist Canadian woman, very articulate and a very good writer. In fact, I read 3 of her books, but that one was the one which was basically talking about how global warming was going to change everything. Another 2 I have read. One was by an Australian so-called scientist called Tim Flannery, and he wrote a book. I haven't got the titles in my head or to hand, but he wrote a book very recently, actually, saying crazy things. And I went through the book in considerable detail and made notes on the things he said, where I was in virtually every case able to say, well, that is absolute nonsense. One of the daftest things he said in the book was that carbon dioxide is the greatest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, when of course it is not. Water vapor is. The other book I read was written by an American called David Wallace Wells. Have you heard of him?
Yes, yeah.
If you're interested in the subject, you're bound to have. And that was the most nonsensical. It was 300 odd pages of utter nonsense. I'm afraid I haven't got examples of that to hand, but I have never read any book promoting global warming or any blog or article promoting the global warming myth, which isn't loaded with nonsense.
Yeah, your experience is similar to mine. I've spent a lot of time reading their books and watching their movies and reading their Twitter feeds, etc. I think it's important that we know what they're saying and understand where they're coming from. I think they don't do as much of that, looking at what skeptics are saying. I think they tend to block us and just assume they're right without really knowing why. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that, Tom. They don't just ignore us. In fact, warmists have it's part of what's called groupthink. Really, they have their belief. They constantly reinforce their belief amongst each other, and they totally refuse to accept any alternative view or any view that disagrees with them. And not only do they not accept it, but they actively try to kill it. They ignore it. They suppress it. They rubbish it, and they deplatform anybody who talks about it. A very good example of that recently, which you will obviously know about, is the case last month where Nobel laureate Dr. John Clauser, PhD, gave a speech in which he said there is no global warming catastrophe. He was then immediately, he was going to make a further speech to the International Monetary Fund, which immediately cancelled his speech. Facebook has a fact-checking system which actually blocks anything on Facebook which disagrees with the global warming narrative. And so it goes on. You get blocked, stopped, rubbished. They attack the messenger. There's lots of ad hominem attacks on people who actually are what they call climate skeptics. I am very proud to call myself a climate denier.
So how do you think that's going over with the public? It seems to me when they get to the point where they're canceling Nobel laureates and saying you can't speak about this, don't you think they're losing more people than they're gaining by doing that cancellation of Clauser, for example?
I wish they were, but I don't think the global warming complex, or what's called the climate change industrial complex, I don't think it's losing very much in the way of support.
Are you seeing that in your personal life or over there in Australia? What's your view as an Australian right now? You're over there as we speak, yes. Right?
One of the greatest problems, the greatest problem of the global warming situation is, of course, this pursuit of net zero, which is being done by Joe Biden, by Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, and here by the Labour left-wing government of Anthony Albanese. And here we are trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 82% by the year 2035. In fact, no, by the year 2030. And of course, that's only 7 years from now. I might still be around, but I'm beginning to feel the effects of it, because just two examples. One is last year, my electricity bill went up by 21%. This year, it went up by a further 35%. So I'm finding, and some years ago, electricity in Australia was very cheap because, of course, Australia is sitting on a huge reserve of coal, which I am strongly in favor of burning. Anyway, that was one feature which has affected me already. And the other one is petrol. About 7 years ago, petrol was about $1 a litre here in Australia. It is now $2.25 a litre, fluctuating a bit. But so that's doubled in price in the last 7 years. And of course, that is not going to come down again. So those are the main effects I have personally noticed here in Australia. But Australia is a lovely place to live.
So wasn't this green electricity thing sold in Australia as we're going to save you money, it's going to be cheaper? And aren't people figuring out that it's not cheaper?
People are figuring it out. It's that is the way renewables are sold worldwide. Wind is free, sun is free, so renewables are going to be cheaper. But the trouble is, for any nation, any business to invest in wind farms and solar farms, they have to have subsidies, huge subsidies. In the UK, it's 10 million pounds a year at least in subsidies to the wind farm and solar farm industry in order for them to be able to invest, because they couldn't sell their electricity at a buyable price if they weren't subsidized by the government. So this is the problem, and it's just the same here.
Would that be 10 million with an M or billion with a B? I just want to make sure we have that.
Wait a minute. 10 this is in the UK. No, it's 10 billion. It is 10.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. You sent me this interesting thing from Goldman Sachs. I don't know if you wanted to talk about those numbers now, about how much was spent on
yes, definitely.
Energy.
Yeah. I think people would agree that Goldman Sachs are probably quite good at number crunching. And what they produced a report in 2021, which said that since 2010 to 2020, the nations of the world had spent $3.8 trillion on trying to do something about global warming. I've always thought that it's quite hard to get your head around the figure of a trillion. So I usually quote the fact that a trillion seconds is 30,000 years. Anyway, $3.8 trillion spent on trying to reduce man's dependence on fossil fuels. And what that has achieved in that 10 years, according to the Goldman Sachs report, is a reduction of the amount of energy produced by fossil fuels from 82% down to 81%.
I think that's an amazing statistic about how little has been achieved with so much money. Yeah, I think it's great
Yes,
stuff.
I do too, yes. But the fact is, of course, Tom, that the world will never be able to survive on renewable energy. What is renewable energy producing in the world at the moment? Something like 2% of the world's energy, and it hardly increases. Meanwhile, of course, mankind's demand for electricity, just taking electricity alone, is constantly skyrocketing as nations like China, India, and many other developing nations want more and more power to give their populations a better life. But not only that, you have what is one of the biggest and not really talked about that much, but it is a fact that I'm perfectly aware of, and that is computers. More and more, the world is absolutely ravenous for data all the time, and the demand for data around the world is jumping, is going up like a moon rocket. And what does data depend on? It depends upon, of course, computers themselves, but huge and vastly increasing solar farms, transmission costs, the costs of the cloud. I don't mean solar farms, I mean server farms. Server farms which are growing like topsy. And of course, they consume a vast amount of electricity for themselves and to keep them cold. So electricity is going up dramatically. Air travel, I mean, there are nations, I think it's one of the Middle Eastern airlines, I think it's Emirates, they have just ordered 100 aircraft from Boeing, I think it is. All the airlines are ordering lots of airplanes. Since COVID, most of air travel has recovered, and so they're all doing it. And of course, can you imagine any aircraft flying on anything but a fossil fuel?
So how is the whole flight shaming thing going in Australia? Are people not flying because they think it's going to cause bad weather? Or are they just flying? I think they're flying. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's a good point. It's another indicator if the airlines are planning ahead and buying more planes, it seems like they think there's going to be more demand and this whole flight shaming thing is not going to work, correct?
That's true. I think so. Yeah. Well, the public is proving it.
Did you want to talk at all then about how Earth's temperature is measured? Any comments on that?
Yes, that's a very interesting one actually, because it's one of the things that the warmists find very easy to fudge or to fake. The most accurate measures or the most accurate ways that have been found to measure the temperature of the world are satellites and balloons. But of course, a lot of measurements are still done by land-based and sea-based temperature gauges, thermometers, call them whatever you like. And they're very interesting because they are, they're all over the world. Well, they're not all over the world. There are vast areas of Siberia and vast areas of the oceans and the forests where there are no temperature gauges whatsoever. But where there are temperature gauges, it gives the global warming industry the opportunity to choose where they take their readings. And the urban heat island effect is a very interesting one because it really, it can affect the actual ambient temperature by 1 or even 2 degrees. And that is something which is very useful for the warmists. For example, wasn't last month, but it was earlier this year in the UK. The mainstream media trumpeted a story whereby it was only for a matter of a few hours or even a few minutes. There was a temperature in the UK which was the warmest temperature ever recorded since hundreds of years ago, apparently. and it was it was a temperature gauge. Do you know where it was sighted?
At an airport near some jets?
Worse than that, it was sighted at the Royal Air Force Air Station near a runway where jet aircraft were landing. So that is why I am very, I know how hard it is. It is virtually impossible, even with the satellite data and the balloon data, it is virtually impossible to say this is the temperature of the world. It's not the temperature of the world. It's the temperature of the little bit of the world that they're looking at the moment. And then if they aggregate it all together, do they produce an average? And if so, what is the average? And how do they produce the world data? They never say. If the alarmist people said the world temperature has risen by 0.1 of a degree in the last 12 months, this has been proved by satellite data taken from 1,800 different positions around the globe, and we have averaged them. They never say that. So we really don't know anything of the background of the temperature data that they present to us.
So not to give, just to go back on that record you're talking about, I think the details are even better. That I think that record lasted for 1 minute, and then it cooled by 0.6 degrees in the next 1 minute.
Yeah, the Cognizant record. Yes, I think it was very, very transient.
I believe there were fighter jets landing right around that time. I think they have that.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't know how big that retraction was, because it got a lot of publicity when they put it out there. I guess maybe there even wasn't a retraction. Did anybody come out and say, oopsie,
There was no retraction. It wasn't mentioned on the mainstream media. It was mentioned, Breitbart is a good one, which I read every day. But I think it was Paul Homewood, or not a lot of people know that, who made a big point about it, because he is, one of his principal, almost exclusive subjects is global warming. And for example, another good example, which he was talking about 2 days ago, was the floods last month in Vermont. The floods last month in Vermont were highlighted by the ultra-warmist mainstream media newspaper in the United Kingdom, The Guardian, as the worst floods in history in Vermont. But that was completely false. As Paul Homewood pointed out, in 1927, there was more flooding, more rain, and 84 people perished. So the Guardian article was, either the journalists were too lazy to do any research, which is easily done in the records that are available in the public domain, or they just, which I think is more likely, they just want constantly to promote the global warming catastrophe scare story. So they lied.
I mean, I'm curious, have you met Paul Homewood in real life, and have you hung around with him?
No, I haven't. No, I didn't start reading him really till I came out here to Australia.
Okay, so there's this whole narrative that you and me, we're part of this well-oiled, well-funded climate denial machine, and we're all we're all meeting, and we're all being funded, and we're receiving orders from up above, but none of that stuff is happening from your side. Are you just working on your own and you're reading people's stuff? And
yes, totally. Of course, the other big conspiracy about put out by the global warming community is that all the denial, all the skeptics and so forth are funded by big oil. But of course, we're not. And one of the most authoritative organizations, which I mentioned earlier, is the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And they state categorically in their documentation that they receive no funding from anything related to the fossil fuel industry. So we're all doing it independently, individually, but there are lots of sources there which we can read.
So how does your typical day go if you're just the hours you're spending working on this issue? Are you doing Google searches and or listening to podcasts, or how does it go for you?
Well, it almost exclusively from reading books and reading the non-mainstream media. I don't use Twitter and I don't use Facebook. I don't use any social media whatsoever.
Very good. Oh, did you want to just talk about, from your perspective in Australia, what's happening with the Great Barrier Reef or the Sydney Harbour tide gauge? Yeah.
The Great Barrier Reef, you could say it's almost, together with polar bears, I would say it's probably one of the poster child of the global warming hoax industry. The Great Barrier Reef, of course, is an iconic piece of Australian geology and geography, and it has been used as a weapon by the warmists to claim that the oceans are acidifying and that warming oceans are destroying coral. We've had coral bleaching events. Nobody denies that we've had coral bleaching events, but they are not caused by warmer oceans. They're usually caused by storms. But the other thing is, the most important thing is that the Great Barrier Reef today is as big or bigger than it ever has been. It is in extremely robust, good health. And there is a man of whom you will have heard called Professor Peter Ridd, who is, I would believe, I've read almost everything he produces. In fact, quite a lot of his articles have appeared in the one mainstream media which does write articles or does print articles which are not pro-warming, which are skeptical of warming, and that is the newspaper. It's a Murdoch newspaper here in Australia called The Australian. And Peter Ridd has written a few articles in there, but he's also written articles elsewhere. And of course, his initial problem was that when he, some years ago, he was a professor employed by James Cook University of Queensland. And a few years ago, he wrote an article which disagreed with some of the points that the university had stated, that the Great Barrier Reef was suffering from a coral collapse or coral decline. And he was immediately fired by the university, which is just another example of the cult of groupthink, where you are attacked or silenced if you in any way question the religion.
So can he get
Great Barrier Reef is great, good, wonderful.
Could Peter Ridd get anything published like this year in Australian mainstream media? Or is there any penetration of climate realism at all on TV over there or in the mainstream media?
No, only in the Australian, the newspaper, The Australian. That's the only one. The other main newspaper, which I originally subscribed to when I first came out here to Australia, was the Sydney Morning Herald, which is a warmist newspaper. It publishes it. Since I started getting interested in all this, Tom, I have actually I have printed out and filed in hard copy a lot of articles, and I keep a lot on a list of favorites on my computer, so that I can immediately refer to them, which I have done, in my homework for this podcast. But there are the mainstream media, a lot of them I've got. The Sydney Morning Herald produced so many nonsensical articles about it. I cut them out and I sort of wrote marginal notes in them and saying this is utter nonsense and so forth. But most of the mainstream media here, television, ABC, of course, is like the UK BBC. They are very warmist. Possibly the most warmist broadcasting organization in the world is the BBC in the UK. The BBC have a stated policy. In fact, a year ago, their head of programs issued an edict to all departments of the BBC saying, we will never allow any skeptical view of global warming, airtime or screen time on the BBC because, quoting the IPCC, the science is settled. So the BBC, are part of the shutting down alternative views outfits.
And there is no sign of the BBC coming to their senses at all, or do you think they're just going to stick with this forever?
I don't. No, I'm afraid not. There's no sign of it at all, Tom.
So I was going to ask you, what do you have seen, the craziest claims you've seen from alarmists? Like you mentioned here, a fit pro cyclist dropped dead in a race, and they blamed that on carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that was in Sardinia. A fit professional cyclist in last month dropped dead in a cycling race in Sardinia, and it was blamed on global warming. A couple of other examples, one in particular, and this again comes from The Guardian in the UK. There are a number of migratory birds that visit the UK, and some of the migratory birds don't visit every year. They only visit occasionally, now and again. And 2 of those species of birds visited the UK this year. One was the black-winged stilt, and that was the name of the bird. And the other name of the bird was the rainbow bee-eater. And they both visited the UK this year, and their visits were blamed on global warming by the newspaper.
That's pretty funny. You seem like you're taking...
Everything is blamed on global warming. Polar bears are en route. Polar bear populations are growing, but they've been a poster child, in fact still are, a poster child for global warming. Every wildfire, every flood, every drought is all blamed on global warming. The wildfires in Greece, they were started, it has been admitted by the Greek government that they were started by arsonists. And the terrible fires in Maui, it is well known that although they've been blamed on global warming, of course, because they'll never miss a chance to blame it, but of course the terrible wildfires in Maui were believed to have been caused by a fallen power line, which still had electricity going through it, still powered, and it landed in this huge area of ultra-dry grass, which caught alight like tinder, and it was fanned by very, very strong winds, and a very tragic result as well. But, you cannot... We had some terrible wildfires here in New South Wales and Eastern Australia in 2019-2020 summer. And our local politician here, who he blamed it on climate change. The trouble is, just like the Californian wildfires and most other wildfires, they're actually caused, something sets the fire alight, and, the heat of the atmosphere couldn't possibly do that. They're not going to ignite spontaneously, but something causes them to ignite. And then what turns them into a dangerous, serious, and often fatal wildfire? Well, 2 things. The main thing is fuel. Fuel, the floors of these forests and bushland in Australia are full of fuel, which is dry, dead leaves. And my house here in Australia is, I own 5 acres of land, which are all bush. And, I walk through it, and, and I can see it all around me, even from my house. The floor of the bush around me, the floor of the forest, is deep in dry leaves. So I have to try and control it sometimes. But here in Australia and also in California, the wildfires got so got so powerful because the fuel load was never reduced. They're doing it quite a lot in Australia, but it wasn't enough, and in some places it wasn't effective at all. But they do controlled burns, and the other thing that they do is create fire breaks. But the Greens are preventing it in California, and the Greens have done a lot to prevent it here in Australia as well. So you end up with something starts the fire, and in Australia it's usually lightning. Something starts the fire, and then you get a windy day, and these are the worst days. We get these fire danger, fire risk warning notices that are permanent signs around Australia, and you get a very dry period and strong winds, and the fire danger becomes extreme. And of course, once the fire starts, the wind whips it, and of course it goes through the fuel like crazy. And then once the fuel gets going, it goes up higher and higher, and it starts to burn the trees. So that's why wildfires are so dangerous. But the other thing is, the historical record, which anybody can access, shows that wildfires in most nations, California, in Australia, have not burnt more acreage recently than they have in the past. In the past, they have burnt more acreage, and the same with the floods.
So is there something you can do on your 5 acres to reduce the fire danger? Anything?
Well, I was talking to a neighbor about this recently, and the fire service here is very good and works very hard, and they've been holding seminars, and I believe there's another one coming up where they help you with ideas what you can do. They also produce a booklet which I have got, which is called a Bushfire Survival Plan. So yes, there are things you can do if a fire takes place and it threatens your property. But as regards the bit of bush around me, there are some things I can do. I can be very careful and do very small burns in small areas, but I have to be so careful that it's not going to spread. So yes, a bit, but it's very difficult to do as an individual.
Do you want to talk about ocean acidification at all?
Yeah, that's another one that they love, don't they? The warmists. The oceans are getting acidified. They're not. The oceans are pH 8.4. And, they might go down to pH 8.3.5 or something like that, but they never have been and never will be acidic.
And pure water is pH 7, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, they've spent a lot of time trying to sell that one, and you're just laughing it off. I like to see that.
Well, I'm laughing it off because it is true, and nobody has ever produced a sample of seawater which is alkaline. They just say it's just propaganda. It's just a lie that they repeat.
They've never produced seawater that's acidic, right?
That's acidic. There's none that's acidic. It's all alkalized. Yes.
Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, it seems like you're taking a lot of joy in this, that you're really enjoying what you're doing and laughing at the insanity.
Well, right? I find it interesting and stimulating, and yeah, it makes me laugh sometimes. Some of the stupid things that appear in the media just make me, laugh almost with sadness.
Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. It's better than being miserable, because this stuff could make you miserable, right? If you looked at it in the other way. Yeah.
It's going to, Tom. It's going to, if we go on towards net zero. I don't want to give up driving my car. I've done enough international travel in my life. I'm not worried about not being able to fly anymore, but a lot of people will be. But yes, it's going to get miserable. Unless politicians and world leaders see the light.
So what's the reception among your family and friends? Do they all think you're crazy, or are they listening to what you have to say?
Yeah, They don't think I'm crazy. I don't actually talk about it much to other people. My
Okay.
son here in Australia, I have another son in England. My son here in Australia thinks I'm obsessed by it and thinks I'm crazy. But I don't mind. It's quite stimulating to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important stuff. And again, I like the stuff you've written about net zero, but specifically why net zero is crazy. You've written several articles on that in Conservative Woman, right?
Yes, I have, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you want me to explain why I think net zero is crazy?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Well, one is it's never going to be achieved. And two, as we go towards it, as I've already mentioned, it's making people's lives much, much less agreeable. We are living today in a world where we have an absolutely most of the civilized world, most of the developed world, and to a greater and greater extent, the developing countries too, are living in a world which is great. We've got enough to eat. The other interesting thing about so-called global warming, the warmists are worried about harvests. Harvests are going to decline. We're not going to have enough food. Well, over recent years, harvests have been at record levels. But if we stop producing fertilizer because we can't use oil and gas to produce it, then food levels are going to be restricted. We're not going to be able to, we're not going to be able to drive anywhere. We've got these absurd restrictions on driving in London. And we've got what are called 15-minute cities being introduced in places like Oxford. It's going to make life miserable for everybody. We're not supposed to eat so much meat. Some countries are going to extremes. In Ireland, they are proposing to kill 200,000 cows because the wind that cows eructate contains methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But worse yet, in the Netherlands, extreme left-wing Prime Minister Mark Rutte is proposing to shut down thousands of the Netherlands farms, the cattle farms, because of the eructations of cattle producing methane, which will destroy the industry, or largely destroy the biggest industry in the Netherlands. And it's interesting that such a small nation is the second largest exporter of foodstuffs in the world. But this reduction in methane that the government of the Netherlands wants to do is because methane is a global warming gas. But methane currently is 335 parts per billion of the atmosphere. So it is totally, totally meaningless, but it's going to produce hardship.
So do you have your finger on the pulse at all of what's happening politically in the Netherlands? Do you think the farmers are going to be convinced to just roll over and take this, or are they not going to take this?
Well, they've certainly not rolled over. They've had these huge tractor convoys in the Netherlands, which have held up the traffic. And they have, this new VBB party, the Netherlands Party of the Farmers, has attracted a very big following in a very short time since it was founded. But it's not yet critical enough to overthrow the government at a general election. But it could be by the time the next general election takes place.
Do you happen to know the logistics of trying to get rid of 20% of the cows? Would they say each individual farmer, you have to get rid of 20% of your cows? Or are they going to just drive 20% of the farmers out of business? I'm curious how they could try to make this happen.
In the Netherlands, they have told farmers that they have either got to stop producing stop farming cattle, or the government will buy out their farms and force them to.
Okay. Do you know if any?
In Ireland, they haven't actually started it yet, but it's a proposal to cull 200,000 cows. So, it could happen.
What's the worst stuff that you are seeing happening in Australia? Any 15-minute cities talk or reducing cattle talk, anything like that, locally there in Australia?
No, nothing obvious at the moment, except the ban on fossil fuel exploration. For example, the state of Victoria is sitting on a very large reserve of very easily accessed gas. But the state of Victoria Premier will not allow it. There is a lot of what they call here coal seam gas. Coal seam gas is essentially fracked gas. But Queensland, which is one of the biggest coal mining states, will not allow fracking. And here in New South Wales, where we have got a vast reserve of coal, they are shutting down coal-fired power stations. I've seen one. I go past 2 coal-fired power stations probably once a month, about 150 miles from where I live. And one of them was shut down very recently. A few years ago, it was belching out steam, of course, not CO2, steam, which is always used as a hoax picture. Anyway, not so long ago, I saw it had stopped because I went by, and the other one was still working, but this one was stopped. And then it started being demolished. And there is the biggest power station in New South Wales is called Eraring, and it produces 20% of the electricity consumed in New South Wales. That is proposed to be shut down in 2025. Nothing to replace it. You had to build an awful lot of wind farms and solar farms to replace that.
Is the plan to just shut it down and bulldoze it, or make sure you can't restart it?
Shut it down and bulldoze it, just like they did in the UK. But in Germany, they shut them down and mothballed them, and they've opened some up again.
Is there any sort of dynamic in Australia where the federal government is telling the states, you got to quit mining coal, and the states are saying, no, we're not going to quit mining coal? Anything like that happening?
No. The states are largely left to their own devices on what they do about mining and mining of coal, gas, and oil.
Okay. All right. We're coming up on an hour already. Are other points you'd like to make here before we wrap this up?
I don't believe CO2 actually traps heat in the atmosphere at all. It has never been proved by a replicable scientific experiment that CO2 traps heat in the atmosphere. Never. And there is no evidence. I always say to people, where's the evidence when they say the earth is warming? I say, where is the evidence? There is no evidence. Everything they produce, which they call evidence, like floods, fires, sea level rise, all that sort of stuff, is not evidence, because it's not happening. Sea level rise is another one they like. The sea level gauge in Sydney Harbour has not shown any rise in sea level since 1914. So there is no evidence. As Professor Ian Plimer said in one of his books, I read both his global warming books, brilliant man and highly qualified to talk on the subject. He said, if there's no evidence of a phenomenon, then the phenomenon doesn't exist.
He'll be on my podcast in a while. He's scheduled.
Is he?
He is.
Ian Plimer?
Yes.
Oh, great. I look forward to that.
Yeah.
What else have we got? Oh, yes. One of my biggest worries, which I did mention, I think, is why why so many intelligent, well-educated, people, politicians, captains of industries, why they believe in man-made global warming. And of course, one of the reasons is the so-called groupthink. But you see, the other thing is, another thing is, so many of these people have absolutely no grounding in science. They have no knowledge of physics, chemistry, and thermodynamics, or almost none. They don't have the time or the inclination to look past the headlines or the information that is fed to them by their staff. And so they believe it. They believe it because they haven't ever had any or haven't ever done any research on the other side of the argument, mostly because it's hidden, because it's suppressed. But to give you a very good example, here in Australia, there are two billionaires, multi-billionaires. One of them is in the mining industry and the other is in the IT industry. And they proposed to construct a giant solar farm in Alice Springs, which is a very hot, very sunny place right in the middle of Australia, as you probably know. And they proposed to export this electricity by cables to, guess where? Singapore, which is 2,652 miles as the crow flies from Alice Springs. They proposed to do that. My immediate reaction when I saw that was twofold. One was, have they not ever heard of copper losses? Do you know what copper losses are?
I do.
Yes. Or just for anybody else who ever watches the podcast, copper losses are what you lose when you send electricity through wire, because a lot of it is dissipated as heat and other things. So imagine the copper losses in 2,652 miles. And that's the direct route as the crow flies. It'd be much longer than that in practice. My other thought was, okay, so Singapore might love it, but they won't get any at night. Anyway, the other thing was, Tom, that the project was abandoned not long ago. And the reasons for the abandonment that they gave were spurious. The reasons were not related to why they really stopped it. The reasons were sort of disagreements between the parties and that sort of stuff. It wasn't because that they realized that the whole thing was completely impossible.
Did they get to the point where they started laying some cable between Singapore and Australia?
They never got to that part.
Thank goodness.
One last thing, I think, Tom, and that is the so-called correlation between CO2 and global warming. And this brings us back to the famous hockey stick graph, which was produced in Al Gore's film, which was in 2006. And amazingly, it was reproduced again in the IPCC's 6th assessment report. This is the hockey stick graph, which was used, which falsely eliminated the medieval warm period 1,000 years ago, where the world, not just in the West, but all over the world, as records and geological investigations have found, the Earth was warmer then than it is today. But it was not preceded by an increase in CO2. It was followed by an increase in CO2. And another example of that is from 1940 to 1975, the climate temperature fell. But CO2 in the atmosphere increased from 300 to 330 parts per million during that time. There is no correlation.
So you've heard what they say, right? Often I raise that and they say, oh, aerosols. They don't provide any data, but they just, okay, it must have been aerosols.
Aerosols were attributed to the damaging of the ozone layer. And of course, that was a successful campaign. And I haven't I've got no worries about that, actually. I think that's quite possibly true. But the trouble is, the climate, the world's climate, is an utterly chaotic system, which nobody can reproduce with these so-called garbage in, garbage out climate models. The climate models, but used by the IPCC, which they rely on so heavily, are actually programmed to give them the results they want, which is what you can do with the climate model if you're a programmer.
Very, very good. All right. Anything else before we wrap up?
I think I've probably said enough now, Tom. It's been very stimulating and interesting.
All right. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. Let's do this again sometime. If you're available, let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
All right. We'll talk to you next time. David Wright.